So it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who many of you met yesterday. He's a professor at the University of Montana, where he teaches and conducts research. His research focuses on the enactment of organizations through communication and communities of practice theory. So it is his interest in communities of practice that brought him onto my current project, the ADBCAP, with the ADBCAP team. And I'm really excited about his willingness to apply it to emergent issues where risk and crisis communication come into play. So for this slot in our program today, I asked him to shape or reshape our conception of what a community of practice can be. And I'm assuming that we have a variety of levels of experiences with communities of practice. So we'll get to the part where we share about our experiences in a little bit. But first, we're going to get an introduction to them. And to do that, please help me welcome Joel Iverson.
Thank you.
I'm going to put your slides.
Oh, you are?
I will do that.
Okay. Then I'm going to do this. Yeah, so I started studying communities of practice out of a knowledge-based system, looking at knowledge management and how do we exchange knowledge a long time ago, and that was coupled with my interest in disaster response and disaster response volunteers. And so I like to I'm curious, how many people have had exposure to or been a victim of communities of practice in their past? Okay. We have a wide variety of experiences. What I'm going to talk about today is to help exactly do that, reshape the way we think about that notion of communities of practice. So, as I say, considering a communities of practice approach, notice it's not starting a new community of practice specifically, and I'll draw that distinction in a moment. But I am a professor of communication studies at the University of Montana. They always like us to show off our mountain that is a part of campus. When I show pictures, Montana State does not have one on their campus. Sorry, I was drinking. We do have this Bobcat Grizz rivalry going on playfully. The slide that this work is really been helped, and it's really helped me to reconceptualize what we're doing through this grant. And when we consider communities of practice approach, right, the big problem, we think about big problems like biosecurity, and they aren't simple. It isn't a small, tight-knit group. It's a wide variety of stakeholders who come together. And when we have effective action, it never happens in isolation, right? We are connected in a way. And so what I like to do, instead of just asking the question of, is this a community of practice or not, which either way, you're still stuck with what you have, right? So the yes or no answer doesn't really matter. Instead, what I like to use is a communities of practice approach to understand what's happening. And when I was brought onto the grant, I was looking at what this was and wasn't, and we ended up with CoP theory as a way to try to improve biosecurity collaboration. And a lot of times when people think of a community of practice, or people use words like family, which is problematic in and of itself for organizations because families can be dysfunctional, and so can teams, right? If you think about teams, these are the dragon boat races in Hawaii. Everybody spends a lot of time trying to get in one direction and rowing together, and it requires extreme coordination, planning, and practice, and for most of us, that is not how our lives work, right? Instead, the reality is that we have multiple directions, we have multiple goals, we have a wide variety of priorities, there's an intermingling that happens, and this is really comes to be true in the example of PED-V, and I'm not here to talk about PED-V today, but if you think about it, interorganizational collaboration, when people set that up, that's usually similar organizations coming together to share a common goal and try to develop, and that's not what happened in the PED-V response. And instead, it was a widely varying organization with a lot of individual stakeholders like the Port Council, Extension, Veterinarian, Production, owners, all of those. And we had to the response quickly bridged a lot of those fissures naturally because there was something impending happening. And we decided that it would really be good to model that out if we could. So I worked on it for quite a while, and this is what I came up with. I think this accurately represents the PED-V response with all of the stakeholders. Or it was just clip art on chaos that I happened to find on the internet, right? But if you think about all of the different ways in which knowledge was shared, all of the different ways in which practices were and weren't changed, and eventually were changed to help deal with it, we can think about how knowledge happens across these kinds of complexities. And one way we can do it is to think about it as communities of practice, because people share a concern, a set of problems, or a passion about a topic. And we want to deepen our knowledge and expertise in that area. And I think that is not just true about Phed-V, but it's also true of biosecurity stakeholders in general, right? That we are a mirrored example of that Phed-V response in a way, that people who teach biosecurity, people who want to encourage better biosecurity practices come from a wide range of backgrounds. And so what we can do, instead of deciding are you or aren't you a COP, we can use the communities of practice theory to understand and analyze what's happening well, and what would we like to change and improve. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of communities of practice, and I really have started to look at a lot of different things, right? We have 3 COP elements. The first there is mutual engagement. How do we engage with one another and don't, right? Some of those barriers and needed resources get at the idea that we would like to mutually engage more or in different ways, or the ways we are currently engaging, how can we use those to a better end? The second way we can analyze our shared enterprise is through shared repertoires. Where do we have best practices? What are the stories or examples? And through my research, stories always comes up as one of the big elements of shared repertoires that communities of practice groups have. And finally, how are we going to navigate what we as a group do? We are in charge of our own navigation. That's negotiation of a joint enterprise. So when we think about that, I've looked at a lot of different groups. It started with disaster volunteers, and then I moved into studying docents at Desert Botanical Garden. With Tim and Deanna Sell now, we looked at the organization of earthquake forecasters and a crisis that they had when some of their forecasters were sort of put on manslaughter charges and thrown in jail in Italy, and they had to change what they were doing. I just have a piece in press with some other folks that study ostomy online support groups and wanted to use COP theory to understand people who have colostomies and other devices, other ostomy devices. I'm not a biologist. I don't know where they go or what they do, but I'm told there are several types. And then this project with Phed-V, and then Danielle actually brought me into a project on our campus looking at 211, which is social services and Special Olympics, and how they could come together as collective stakeholders in a community to better serve the disabled. So we've looked at a lot of groups. And when you think about, so I have one slide on each of these 3 elements just to pique your thinking about, as you're thinking about what you do, the various groups that you connect with, how can we mutually support each other in biosecurity, how do each of these elements work? How can we better mutually engage? How can we take advantage of the mutual engagement we have? So if you think about mutual engagement, it's an interaction in practices. We can offer insights, we can adopt practices. We just shared frustrations, right? Even when we were talking about our dreams at our table, we got to frustrations very quickly. And it's not just how often you engage, it's the meaningfulness of it and how it relates back to practices. So for example, with the Red Cross disaster volunteers that I studied, they didn't get together very often, only if there was a disaster, when people were on call, and they happened to be available. So mutual engagement was a real problem. And the instant solution was, let's go bowling together or do something like that. And a lot of the volunteers said, I already have a social life, right? I don't need to go out and go bowling with you. But if we can do something related to our practices, that would be helpful. And so what they decided to do was start to move their meetings to places like the firehouse so that they could engage and talk to the firefighters that we would see on fire calls all the time, and to try to find ways to have the whole team do a task that one person might be able to go do by themselves, but why not take it as an opportunity to mutually engage, right? So if we think about mutual engagement and where that happens as one element, the second one is a shared repertoire. Right? Specialized knowledge and resources of what and how. Stories consistently came up across every one of those studies. That stories and examples are always a part of that. knowing the terminology was proof that you were a part of a group. I paid for college by trucking for North American Van Lines as a mover and driver, and I had a doctoral student come in at Texas A&M who had done his master's thesis on blue-collar humor. His father had been a day trader and then switched to being a trucker for a moving company, and that's where he did his thesis. And we were having a conversation about that, and about 10 minutes into it, he said, "You weren't lying. You really did this." Like, yeah, I really did this, and I have proof with my knee that a piano landed on once, right? But once we were talking and I knew the terminology, he knew that I really had done the activity, right? And I was really a part of that community of practice. And developing those shared repertoire skills and activities, I have a picture here of a house. One of the things you learn in disaster response is how to do damage assessment. By the way, if you were doing a drive-by, this would be a 3. It's a total loss, right? It's slightly off the foundation. Right? You can just mark a 3 on the address on your sheet and keep driving, right? In a fire or others, you have to go in and more carefully assess the damage and what is salvageable and what is not. But you learn those repertoires, you learn those practices, and that's what we want to do with biosecurity. Right, is how do we get people to consider those practices, be aware of them, certainly engage in them. The final element I have is negotiation of a joint enterprise, and that is how we take our shared situation and navigate it. I think it's like collectively navigating a ship. Sometimes it feels like we're building the ship or plane while we're flying or sailing it, right? That you're trying to do both at the same time. And I have a picture here of the Desert Botanical Garden. You can see the saguaros, you can see the ocotillo actually in bloom, so you can't see the dangerous spikes that it's hiding. And one thing that happened there as a real short story is that when I got to studying the docents, they asked me to come in, mainly because I begged to, and it was part of my dissertation. But the other reason was they said, we have this amazingly successful volunteer group, and we have no idea why. Why are they successful? And the first day that I went into the room, before they all go out, they do things like lead tour groups or have a touch cart, or they'll show different things around the Desert Botanical Garden so that people can have a better and more knowledgeable experience of it. There was a brown sheet of paper on the table as you walked into this room, and everybody's standing around talking coffee. There's a lot of lines on there where people can sign up for their 2 activities of the day. One person had signed up as the second person on leading a tour. Nobody else signed up. And then about 5 minutes before it was time to go, people just sort of lined up and started signing up for activities. And I thought that was weird, and it was. So I said, why are you doing it that way? And one of the volunteers said, well, I like giving tours, but I know that Bill likes to give tours. So this morning I was talking to Bill. I'm like, so what are you going to do, Bill? He's like, oh, I think I'm going to give a tour. So I'm not going to give a tour to let Bill give a tour. I'm going to do this other activity instead. And so they were spending their morning talking to each other about what they wanted to do. So when they were making the decision of what activity to sign up for, they weren't choosing it just because of themselves. They were thinking about everybody else. And there are a lot of ways they could have signed up for activities. They could have raced in. The first one in there gets the better activity. They could have rotated them through on a basis. But when I brought it up to them, I brought it back to the volunteer groups, they said, oh my gosh, we never even thought about that. And I said that was one of the keys to their success as a volunteer program, was the way they happened to sign up was considering each other and connecting with each other and negotiating that joint enterprise rather than as a selfish act, as a collective act. And so how you choose to negotiate, the very act you're doing, can make a difference in what your experience is like as a part of the biosecurity community. Does that make sense? All right. So overall, when we think about it, the questions we want to ask is, how can we improve your biosecurity practices, the practices of others? Can biosecurity stakeholders do more to become their best COP? And the way we think about communities of practice is a lot of companies tried to just create them, or organizations are like, we're going to have a COP, and they dropped it in, right? And the answer is, it's sort of like lettuce. You can't just build lettuce or cows, right? You can't build either livestock, you can't build those. You have to cultivate them, right? You can prep the soil, you can plant the seeds, you can water, you can do all the caring you want, but you can't make the plant grow. Right? It's going to do what it wants, or what it does. And communities of practice are the same way. Management often tries to go in and control and make them happen. And Etienne Winger and lots of others who've studied communities of practice say there's no way that you can just build a community of practice and have it be successful. It has to be cultivated and nurtured and allow it to take the direction it happens to take. Because, right, you negotiate your joint enterprise, you mutually engage in the way that you will, and you share repertoire how you do. So I don't have a good ending slide. That's where I'll stop.